Hey guys, we're going to review really quickly some information on different types of conservation. And this is a follow-up to your reading from last class, both in AUX and in the Science Behind the Scenes. So there's a lot of different conservation organizations that aim to protect biodiversity. And we'll talk about how they do that in a minute. But we can divide them into kind of two broad categories. Governmental organizations and non-governmental. So let's talk about the GOs or governmental first. Some examples you may be familiar with are the United Nations Environmental Program or the International Union for Conservation of Nature, and that's IUCN, and they make the red list that catalogs threatened and endangered species and extinct species worldwide. Also, the CITES agreement was created back in the late 60s, I believe, maybe early 70s. And this is the Convention on International Trade of Endangered Species. And this agreement was also a governmental, not really an organization so much, but kind of like a collaboration of governments to monitor endangered species back in a time when not a lot of people were talking about the effect endangered species were going to have or the rate at which they were going extinct. Response time of GOs tend to be pretty slow because a lot of the countries with very different interests must reach consensus. There's a lot of constraints when it comes to governmental organizations, and this includes each country may have a different legal requirement or focus. And the leaders in those countries and the priorities change. You know, a lot of the lofty goals that governments had in the early 2000s were really they were reprioritized when we came to the major recession. And then lastly, thirdly, the tension in reaching agreements on these really depends on a lot of other factors. It's not very simple. And so you might have more economically developed countries proposing changes that lesser economic developed countries don't find fair. And there can be social constraints or equitability features in terms of are people treating their citizens fairly. There is some enforcement that GOs have that NGOs don't, in that they can impose fines and they can create laws, especially like the European Union has done this, where they have the body listed above, that can basically kind of create and monitor environmental laws. Because of their agreement. NGOs are a little bit different. These are non-governmental organizations, and that can look very different in different places. So probably the most famous is World Wildlife Fund. This is not actually their logo, but I think they sued WWF a while back to get their letters back. But WWF and the panda, you've probably seen them places. You'll see them as sponsoring a lot of stuff. They're probably one of the most famous NGOs working on the biodiversity crisis. So other, more radical examples could include Greenpeace. You have private land trusts that can be as small as the city organization, or super, super big like the Nature Conservancy. And these are organizations that buy land to usually protect species or habitat. I used to work at a land trust in Illinois that was started by many wealthy landowners that have in turn whatever their original motivations were, which is probably to preserve space near their homes. They've become an incredible force in the northern Chicago region in terms of preserving very rare species. The response time of NGOs, because they don't have a lot of the bureaucracy of governments, or they have different bureaucracy, is very rapid, especially following natural disasters or following governmental crises. They can react very quickly. They have some other constraints to consider, though. Their influence varies. A lot of these organizations really depend on the will of the people. And the more collective the people are, the stronger these organizations are. And the less people care, the less power these organizations have. They also can't enforce laws. They are subject to, the money that they have. Luckily, a lot of those in the United States are fairly well funded, but globally this can be a big issue. But they have a really unique role in filling in what government can't do. So these private land trusts, for instance, can sometimes purchase or work with landowners to purchase land that the government cannot. Maybe because of budget cuts, or maybe because of reputation in the city. And the name of some of these really large land trusts can actually create a lot of sway, and that's can be a very positive thing in terms of protecting species. Okay, there are other conservation or other factors of conservation organizations that we want to talk about. Both governmental organizations and non-government organizations can act on a really small scale or a really, really large scale. And no matter whether you're on the local or global level, some of the tension is going to always be between ecological and economic factors. And that, a strategy that has been fairly successful is trying to educate people on the economic losses in the future and how much greater they're going to be than the small economic loss now. For instance, with climate change, when we talk about climate change, this strategy is really significant. We may feel it's painful to invest in green energies or to change or limit ourselves in some of the things we do, like driving, etc. But the economic losses and the changes to quality of life in the future are going to be so much greater if we don't do anything that sometimes it gets us to kind of slow down a little bit and take a broader look at the issue. Private interests can also benefit conservation efforts. They can put a lot of money towards solutions. They can donate to some of those NGOs that we talked about before. But a lot of corporations have also been accused of greenwashing, which is to use marketing or small little efforts to cover up really large negative environmental consequences. So some examples of greenwashing, you can make up your own mind about this. The intentions can be very good, or they can be negative, and it's really up to you to decide. A company that has been accused of greenwashing before is British Petroleum, or BP. They used to have this logo here, and I think it was in the early 2000s they switched to this logo here, and you may have seen some of their green commercials talking about their environmental gains. And this may be true. It also is true that they're partly responsible for one of the worst not natural disasters we've had in recent memory with the BP oil spill. Another example could be a lot of the discussion around clean coal. A lot of people argue that there is no such thing as clean coal. You can put scrubbers on factories, and you can do other things, but at the end of the day, coal is going to produce byproducts that are not good for climate change. I like this comic. And then, some people have accused car manufacturers of greenwashing in that they produce, really large cars. No matter how fuel efficient your car is, if you're producing a large car, it's going to require more energy to move it. And not addressing the idea that we don't need these large cars. I like this picture because it's talking about, a lot of these really large SUVs are flex fuel, meaning they can run on ethanol. But that still doesn't address the issue that the land to grow the corn, and the water to grow the corn, and the fertilizer to grow the corn, and the fact that that corn is being diverted from other farm uses, doesn't really address the issue that we're still using a lot of resources to produce less efficient cars than most of the population needs. There are people that need these large cars, but do we all need these large cars? Let's talk about some of the measures that these organizations use to conserve. About the three common approaches. We have species, ecosystem, and genetic diversity, and we can kind of focus our conservation measures on one of these three things. And by far, species conservation is the most successful. Megafauna, large things like the spotted owl or the California condor, even though you don't think this guy is good looking, these are easy to gain attention for, right? And so examples of conservation measures that have used the species approach include the Environmental Species Act, even that international governmental group that formed CITES for banning the trade of endangered species across international borders, either for food or others. And then captive breeding programs like the California condors, where they gathered all the remaining survivors around and used them to breed. Another common approach on the, you have a little repeat there. Habitat efforts largely focused around the species level, so even the ecosystem approach usually uses marketing of the species to be successful and to gain funds. The quality of habitat conservation really varies, and but restoration can make a significant improvement to the ecosystem. Think of your area at home. What city parks do you have owned by local government? We have Tualatin River National Wildlife Refuge that's funded by federal efforts. And we have private preserves or large ranches that are kept. One thing to keep in mind here, you guys, is that corridors can have a really big effect in connecting these different areas and making habitats, that also affects genetic diversity, but making habitats connected. And genetic measures are usually components of the other two, but we have things like seed banks and some of our zoo efforts that are keeping the genetic instructions on file. One question is, what good does that do if you have genetic information on file, but you aren't really protecting the habitat that is required for those species? Since I'm not there, we will skip the pair share, but I want you to keep in mind the different organizations that work collectively sometimes to preserve biodiversity. And I really want you to think about, is there something missing? Is there something more that needs to be part of this conservation picture? And that's the next thing that we'll talk about.